Hello and welcome to Unpacking Terms. The term we're going to unpack today is interlanguage. And what I'll present here is a simplified version of the work by Selinker, primarily since he was the one who coined and proposed that term. But I will also be referencing Corder, Tyrone, and Larsen Freeman, among other scholars. So what is interlanguage? It is essentially the linguistic system that learners develop as they acquire a language. And a basic premise of interlanguage is that the forms that learners produce show patterns. They are not just random forms, random errors. And the term interlanguage is describing this system, which some might call learner language. And to describe interlanguage or learner language, we use spontaneous oral output when the student is trying to convey meaning orally. Why? Because for Selinker, this is where we can see some evidence of the underlying system. Giving this system its own name, interlanguage, we are validating the systematic nature of it. And we need to understand the context in which the interlanguage was proposed. And back then, the only two systems that were looked at were native language and target language. Target language would be this idealized system, if you will. Native language would be the language as it is used by native speakers, monolingual native speakers. And so Selinker and Corder both said, we need to be looking at learner language as a language in its own right. And indeed, a major influence in the concept of interlanguage is Corder, 1967, who said that learners exhibit transitional competence. You could say that is essentially what the interlanguage was all about. And this transitional competence is guided by a built-in syllabus. The learner is in charge, as Bill Van Patten says, and these ideas challenged views on the effects of explicit instruction for sure, and also the nature of errors. Not all can be explained by transfer. So let's talk about the phenomena associated with interlanguage. Transfer is one of them, and that would be the influence of another linguistic system, usually the native language. Then we have overgeneralization, and that would be, for example, the regularization of irregular forms. Now, overgeneralization is something that we also see in monolingual native speakers, so it is not exclusive to interlanguage. And then the most controversial phenomenon that Selinker proposed is fossilization. And that is when certain aspects of the system get stuck, so to speak, at a level that deviates from the target. And they do not evolve any further. No matter what. Doesn't matter how much more input we give them. Doesn't matter if they get any corrective feedback. It just does not change. Now, the intent of the interlanguage concept was good, and that is to focus on the development of an evolving system, as opposed to looking at all of the shortcomings, focusing so much on errors. But we are still distinguishing it from the target. And so the question is, when we say that the system is different, is that good? Or is that bad? If you look at these two pictures, are you focusing on all of the things the first one has? Or are you focusing on all of the things that it lacks? Could we take the first one to mean that it's growing? Or do we look at it as perhaps incomplete? And indeed, some see the term interlanguage as something positive. It celebrates or validates the process of acquiring a language, of language development. On the other hand, some see it as a problematic take because we might be implying that this interlanguage, that learner language, is potentially inferior or incomplete compared to this native speaker language. And of course, a very important question is Is there a singular native speaker language? The issue of comparing learner language with native speakers has been criticized by many. In this quote by Ortega says it best, and it says, "Wittingly or unwittingly, SLA researchers often portray development as a transitional state that is, or should be, ever-changing towards the target. Implied in this construct is also an idealized monolingual native speaker who is held to be the ultimate yardstick of linguistic success." And I think this quote is very relevant because of this transitional state. You could argue that that's a little bit of what Interlanguage was talking about, and that it is evolving towards the target, this idealized monolingual native speaker. Our students will never be that. We don't want them to be monolingual to begin with, and we know they're not going to be native speakers. So why are we comparing them to monolingual native speakers? And Larson Freeman hones in on this issue and how that is actually counterproductive to the main intent of the concept of interlanguage. And she wrote, "Introducing a target L2 perspective undermines the strongest argument for the interlanguage construct, meaning that it is a language in its own right and needs to be examined as such." Another challenge or criticism associated with the interlanguage concept is the concept of fossilization. Some scholars would argue that there is no way to prove unequivocally that something has been fossilized, and this is related to the question of whether there is an end state. Tyrone says that this issue is far from settled. Another challenge, at least for me, is this issue of labeling and separating these three systems: the idealized target language, the native language, how native speakers use the language, and then an entirely separate category for interlanguage or learner language. Why can't it be all language? Why can't we say that a learner is speaking the target language at their level? If we use a separate term that is not target language, aren't we in some way implying that they're not speakers of the target language? So the key word here is growth. Not only because there is a lot of professional growth in questioning or challenging the terms we use through different lenses, but also because it is very important for us as educators to understand, recognize, and validate the systematic growth of our students' language. There's still a lot more to unpack, so be sure to subscribe. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.